going to remind myself of the schedule once again. Okay, 12 to 1, we have this lecture on falling and immigration. I realized last night that I can't really tell the story of falling in the Danticat story without talking about how representations of falling had been perceived in the last 2 decades. So I added in a little bit of 9/11 representation and photography. So we have this lecture from 12 to 1, and then lunch at 1, and then we'll all come back for the AI lecture at 2 p.m. Does that sound right? Everybody's on the same page? We're good. Okay. So this next lecture picks up on our conversation about trauma and representations of immigration. It started with an idea that I had about Edwidge Danticat's Without Inspection. That also was in your reading packet. We'll refer to that in the second half of this presentation. So I will begin. As Cathy Caruth argues in a pivotal chapter in Unclaimed Experience, Paul Deman's The Resistance to Theory considers how Adam Newton's theory of gravitational force might inform the story of how the problem of reference became, in the history of thought, inextricably bound up with the fact of literal falling. So she is interested in how the idea of falling, of the gravitational pull, is bound up with the problem of how to talk about that. And that is how we can think about the problem of reference. How do you refer to falling? According to Caruth's reading of Deman, the problem of reference is exemplified by scientific, philosophical, and artistic questions about how to refer to falling. Falling in this reading is a figure for the difficulty of referring to something that is impossible to fully assimilate into consciousness and the system of language. For Deman and Caruth after him, it is not simply the fact of falling that is a surprise, but also the emergence of the law in 1687 of universal gravitation, describing the gravitational attraction between bodies with mass. So for the scientists, for the physicists, like imagine this, 1687, the discovery, the scientific discovery of gravity, of knowledge that something can fall, and what the science is behind that. I don't know about you, but I'm desperately afraid of falling. I'm afraid of diving. I'm afraid of tripping. I'm just afraid of falling over. And I think there's something there, right? Like, there's a real discomfort in that idea. And we're going to think about how that helps represent traumatic experience in literature. As Caruth points up, Newton's theory reveals that everything is falling all of the time, so there is never a stable reference point. What we call falling, then, is just a special case of something that is always there. The related problem, Caruth speculates, is not simply confronting the science behind falling, but the fact that there are perhaps no words to refer to such a moment. Granted, many of us survive our perpetual moments of falling perfectly well. However, the limit case, such as the figure of the falling man we will take up in this lecture, emphasizes, to borrow from Caruth, quote, an example of the occurrence of difference, the difference between living and dying, which resists being generalized into a conceptual figure or law. This is the difference that, we recall, appeared in but remained inassimilable to the formal system, a difference it could not know, just as we could add, the system was unable to know the event of falling. How does one refer to falling, if at all? Not only was the scientific community shaken by the theory of gravity, but those of us who find our faith and strength in the potential of language to convey the unimaginable felt that impact as well. Such difficulty, we imagine, might be undercut by the potential of the image as rendered through the photographer's lens. Back to photography. However, even the photograph, or more precisely, especially the photograph of the falling men in the wake of 9/11, were met not with grief, then horror, then outrage, then were met with grief, then horror, then censorship in the wake of 9/11. I'm going to give a trigger warning for this one, but maybe you have seen the image already. Have you seen this before? It was on newspapers all over 9/12/01, and then taken down one at a time when people were horrified and shocked to see it. Tom Junod's award-winning 2003 article for Esquire magazine seeks to determine why, as he tracks especially the search to determine the identity of a falling man in the now iconic photograph taken by Richard Drew, why this was so provocative. Some families, he says, when asked to identify whether the man in the photograph is relation, are hostile even to looking at the picture itself. He ultimately surmises that imagining the possibility of a family member jumping to his death reveals a betrayal of faith, or the quest to return home safely. However, what interests me most about this piece is what connects it to backlash over a mural that I'll show you in a little bit. It is actually, artistically speaking, a lovely photograph. It is perfectly symmetrical. It reveals a sense of freedom and defiance. It is balanced exactly right. It is centered exactly right. There is a kind of grace to it. Critics have said that doesn't matter. This is a traumatic moment in an individual's life, and maybe we are inappropriate to capture it. Perhaps it is Junod's poetic description of the photograph that links it so directly with art. Junod writes in his Esquire magazine article, in the picture, he departs from this earth like an arrow. Although he has not chosen his fate, he appears to have, in his last instance of life, embraced it. In the picture, he is frozen. In his life outside the frame, he drops and keeps dropping until he disappears. What stands out for me here is the accidental symmetry of the photograph, the fact that the photograph is so balanced. The falling body itself, quote, achieves geometric balance. While Richard Drew has captured a terrible, grisly event here, he has done it with an artist's eye, but is still unable to render the moment any more imaginable than that of any other depiction of falling from that day. It's worth mentioning that the photographer was a fashion photographer. He was on the train going to cover a fashion show in New York City when he had this impulse to get off the train and go to ground zero. And he used his camera to start taking pictures of what he saw in terms of bodies falling. Some readers of the Esquire article, and indeed many family members presented with the photograph when asked to identify the man, think only of the betrayal of suicide when they see this man falling. The photograph asks the viewer to confront many grisly subjects, the terrorist attacks being only one of them. In many ways, this lecture stages an extended conversation with Anthony Lane, who immediately remarked on this disturbing sight of people falling from the ledges on 9/11, and Cathy Caruth, who asked, how the problem of reference became, quote, bound up with the fact of literal falling. Caruth had no way of knowing that, not only in the history of thought, but also in the history of history, capital H, reference would pose such a problem to writers, critics, photographers, poets, and novelists who tried to capture the reality of people falling from the ledges. So I want to spend a little bit of time here kind of thinking about the falling man in the context of 9/11, and then think about the falling man in the context of Danticat's story about immigration. Also begins with the fact of a man falling, and how difficult it is for people to grapple with this. Image in literature, image in photography, image in art. Why is that? It sends me back to Caruth saying this is a fundamental problem of the 20th century. I have previously argued in Falling After 9/11 that the problem of reference bound up with the fact of literal falling in the wake of 9/11 is not that there are no adequate words or signs. The problem, conversely, is that there are too many situations in which we still cringe at the sight of falling. In the 21st century, performance art, photographs, poems, even advertisements seem to refer in excess, addressing not only something totally related to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but also inextricably calling to mind the memory of the most horrific images from that day and days before and days after. That was not the only time we saw cases of people falling. Tom Junod's short 2012 piece responding to the nearly national hysteria over the recent advertising for the AMC hit show Mad Men bears this out. Are there any people who were Mad Men fans at the time? To advertise the first episode of season 5 of Mad Men, AMC printed a poster featuring a man in a suit, rendered in black and white, apparently falling out of an office window from high above the ground. People were stunned. As Junod argues, when a television network is accused of exploiting a sacred image for its own purposes, it's worth looking once again at the image in question to see what these purposes might be. In particular, it's worth reminding ourselves that the guardians of American culture have been exploiting sacred images since at least 9/12. As for Junod, I do not think he cares as much about the AMC advertisement as he does the, quote, guardians of culture, those who, as I shall argue in a little bit, insisted that Richard Drew's stunning photograph of a man falling from the North Tower be removed from print media altogether. Examples of accusations of writers who appear to be exploiting the figure of the falling man abound in early 21st century literature, which points to my sense that we are now at a particular crisis point in art and literature. A crisis point generated by the fact that whatever images or words or symbols that we use to communicate the experience of falling will perpetually, inevitably, unwittingly point back to trauma we cannot seem to get out of our heads. Junod remarks in his 2012 piece called Falling Madmen that after he published his Esquire piece on the Drew photograph, he got a call from a friend who said, "Well, now you have a book." I asked him what he meant, and he told me that anyone I wanted to write about could be written about for a book called The Falling Man, because in his words, we're all falling men now. And I wonder about that on a metaphysical or a metaphorical level. To what extent are we all falling men? Have we always already been falling? Of course, that's literally true. With a sustained reading of various representations of falling people, and crucially of the criticism of those representations ranging from uncomfortable to outraged, I see us falling in more than ways than one. When reference fails us, it may seem we have very little left to grasp hold of. There's another image that I think is of falling that was also met with outrage around the same time. Often in literary and artistic works about falling, critics take offense. Graydon Parrish's mural, Cycle of Terror and Tragedy, commissioned by the New Britain Museum of American Art in my hometown, after 9/11 is a case in point. It was met with criticism that bordered on hostility. In the cases of these critics, the painting is paradoxically too beautiful. It is too polished. It is too symmetrical. It is too clearly an homage to the Renaissance painters who inspired Parrish and, as a result, cannot be taken seriously as a piece that depicts the harsh brutality of the events of war. I think even now art critics are looking for something more like Picasso's Guernica, right? This fracturing sense of violence. Parrish himself on the phone said that he was devastated by the critical attacks. He was asked to paint something based on his research with his method and then was just attacked repeatedly in big newspapers. It appears as though critics in contemporary art and literary worlds demand representation of trauma fraught with jarring images. It is as though the critical community desires images and texts that are raw and unpleasant in order to convey the unpalatable nature of the pain associated with the day. So we can return to this and do a close reading of the images themselves, if you'd like, at the end, the photograph or this painting. I don't know how much you can see from there, but painted in the Renaissance style, you have these two strong, virile bodies about to go down, their mouths agape, right? And then a chorus of crying women around them. Very unpopular. In fact, it is true that, it may be worth noting here that most of these critical tropes against beauty in response to trauma are rather well worn, having first gained attention related to aesthetic representations of the Holocaust. Perhaps the best example of this type of criticism is Adorno's notorious declaration that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. However, Adorno's claim about poetry comes from a worry about participating in the culture that produced it, thus making the poet inadvertently complicit in that horror. The worry, in other words, is not related to the failure of witnessing, but rather to an observation that the aesthetic nature of such poetic witness undercuts its ideological force. In fact, it is true that what Parrish has created is a symmetrical allegory. The twin bodies, strong, virile, and painted as though part of a Botticelli painting, are also allegories for the virile twin towers about to fall. The children holding planes represent the loss of innocence of an entire nation. In the fall of the old man and the mothers and the children, we see the fall of a nation, each image neatly capturing the horror of September 11. But I also think this can be read allegorically beyond that day. This anxiety, overtly aesthetic, is not exclusive to the art world. There was a rush of poems and novels, and invariably reviewers gestured toward the difficulty of such representation. Rather than see this as a commentary or the difficulty of depicting a single horrific moment in time, they see it as an aesthetic failure at its most insulting. So I'll go through a few examples of literary texts that represent falling after 9/11, each met with critical dismissal at best, like at its kindness. And then I want to kind of think about how that discourse transfers to our understanding of representations of falling in immigration literature, as you see in Danticat's work. Jonathan Safran Foer's, again, remember Oscar, who says he has heavy boots, ends with dozens of pages with images of the falling man ordered in reverse. So when flipped the right way, these pages reveal a man flying back up. Foer has been criticized as being precious at best, and at worst, he has been criticized as a writer willing to capitalize on such tragedies as 9/11 and the Holocaust both. William Hayen, editor of September 11, 2001, American Writers Respond, didn't fare much better than Foer and Parrish. Bill Marvel of the Daily Dallas Morning News suggested, quote, "There is much that might have been improved by a second or even third thought." For Marvel, this art, the art of 9/11, of falling, was published too hastily. There is always a sense with this material that it is too soon to convey any kind of meaning or reparation about the event. It was certainly true in 2002 when the collection American Writers Respond appeared in print. Further, the proliferation of artistic responses to the 9/11 attacks by the summer of 2002 led New York Times reviewer Michiko Kakutani to question this. Is that distracting with my slides on the left? I forgot how to go to slideshow. And then from current slide. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. What is the line between preserving our historical memory, ensuring we will never forget, as the banner erected over Ground Zero pledged, and cashing in on a terrible event between remembering and exploiting the dead? Does reading about or viewing pictures of that day, that September day, reopen old wounds or help us come to terms with our loss? Kakutani seems to believe that 9/11 art will not be able to help us come to terms with our loss at all. And to make matters worse, Kakutani has now charged those who make any attempt of representing the historical trauma with exploiting the dead. Meanwhile, Don DeLillo's long-awaited Falling Man from 2007, also referred to last time with the Bill Lawton example, received immediate attention, led by Kakutani, who ultimately claimed that for the reader approaches Mr. DeLillo's post-9/11 work with great anticipation. Unfortunately, his strangely stilted 2003 novel Cosmopolis was a terrible disappointment, and so is his spindly new novel Falling Man. There is a double bind in the criticism against representation of falling. Reviewers, politicians, and audiences clamor for artists to interpret the great questions of the day. What does it mean to fall? To use their talents on behalf of all of us to voice something as the horrible and repeated image of the falling man, and immediately dismiss the results as inadequate or inappropriate because of their beauty. The events of 9/11 have brought the double bind to the fore, as critics appear largely unanimous in calling this art, from paintings to poetry to novels and photography, a failure. And I'd invite you to think about other examples. I know I come from a very specific reference point. My area of specialty is 20th and 21st century American literature. And I wonder, to the extent you can kind of think about references or images of falling in the art and literature that you read, and how well it is received or accepted as appropriate or inappropriate, beautiful or horrific, or both. In the cases of 20th and 21st century trauma, those vested with the task of reviewing new work often seem to have rejected representations completely out of hand, either as being too perfect or too imperfect, written too early or too late. They seem not to understand fiction or art as appropriate witness or response to trauma, and as a result, it seems we have reached a crisis point, as I've been saying. a moment where testimony, documentary-style photography, and newspaper reportage have emerged as being somehow more aesthetic and affective, more moving, even than art. I think that's true of the Richard Drew photograph, Falling Man. It was a picture, and it has been read from so many points of view, as an artistic document being one of them. And we might consider, in this immigration context, the power of Valeria Lucielli's Tell Me How This Ends as another example, right? A piece of nonfiction compared with Danticat's Without Inspection, how we might approach or receive or respond to a nonfiction work like Tell Me How This Ends, which is very powerful, belly sadness, right? As opposed to maybe fiction that equally that matches it or might fail altogether. I want to make sure we have time to discuss. So building on the work of John Duvall, who wrote an article called Witnessing Trauma, Falling Man and Performance Art, I want to think about the vexed image of the falling man in order to consider its failure on almost all accounts and what that failure can teach us about the place of representation in literary arts in the 21st century. I'm curious about what you think about Danticat's representation of the falling man, whether that seems like a success to you or a failure or maybe somewhere in between. How do we interpret, as a culture, repeated references to the trope of the falling man, images that never quite seem to capture the horror of lived experience, and yet emerge as though via traumatic repetition again and again and again? I propose that this repetition of a single trope of the man falling, and apparently one that repeatedly fails despite multiple attempts at rendering this history, exemplifies what theorists of deconstruction and trauma would refer to as the problem of reference. So I'll end with one more example of a literary example of falling from the 9/11 tradition, and then we'll move on. One literary example depicting the reality of a man falling comes in the form of Frederick Baedeker's 2004 novel, Windows on the World. The novel ends not with one man falling, but a man and his two children, back to our conversation about children, one who has already died from smoke inhalation. Just before the jump, the father, named Carthew Yorston, thinks, "We're going home. We're taking your little brother home. Come and surf the clouds of fire. You were my angels, and nothing will ever split us up again. Heaven is being with you. Take a deep breath, and if you're scared at all you gotta do is close your eyes." The novel is highly emotional, in part because of this moment and many others leading up to it, scenes written intentionally with elevated language to capture the horror of the event. But precisely because it depends on poetic language, these passages are beautiful, heightened by images of clouds of fire and flying angel. The chapter ends with Yorston saying, quote, "For a split second, I really believed we were flying." With this context in the background, we may now turn to Edwidge Danticat's Without Inspection. It's a short story from your packet, it doesn't take long to read, that appeared in the New Yorker in 2018. So we're moving forward now about 15 years. Danticat was born in Haiti in 1969, and it is said that her immigrant experience radically affected her writing. Deborah Treisman has described Without Inspection as a love story between two undocumented immigrants from Haiti who have traveled to Miami by boat. While Danticat agrees it is a love story, Arnold, the protagonist, seems to fall in love with Darlene from the moment he sees her washed up with him on shore. It also seems to be a story of love for the promise of new life in the U.S. Danticat has said in this interview, When I first moved to Miami from New York, among the recurring news items that often caught my attention was one about boats coming ashore, there's our word ashore, filled with people from either Cuba or Haiti. The Cubans were considered political refugees and were allowed to stay. The Haitians were considered economic refugees and were often sent back. These many years later, I wanted to write about what might happen to one particular man, Arnold, after he got here. So remember, Danticat is Haitian. She's interested in the fact that Haitians were considered economic refugees and were often sent back when they arrived on U.S. shores. It gives nothing away, in case you haven't read the story yet, to say that this story also begins with a tragic fall. The very first line reveals to us that Arnold is falling to his death. Quote, "It took Arnold 6.5 seconds to fall 500 feet. The entirety of the story, then, is his life flashing before his eyes. While this is a kind of mythic reference, we might think of Icarus and Daedalus. That was my touchstone, for example, which depicts at once the effects of hubris and the unimaginable experience of falling to one's death without a witness. Or we might connect it to the myths of the African diaspora, as Danticat has done. For Danticat, quote, "Flight is a powerful spiritual motif for some of us who are children of the African diaspora. Many of our ancestors saw flying, both real and imagined, as an escape from the unbearable circumstances of the Middle Passage, slavery, and some of what came after. Halfway through writing the story, I began thinking of that beautiful line at the end of Toni Morrison's magnificent novel Song of Solomon. If you surrendered to the air, you could ride it." That is another moment of falling/flying/freedom. And here is another author, I might add, that seems to conflate falling with flying, the high-speed moment of one falling to one's death, 6.5 seconds, she says, and the freedom of flying away. While he is falling, Arnold reflects, quote, "No, it was simpler to be free as this fall, which he had neither intended nor chosen. This dive that had resulted from his left foot slipping off the scaffold and his body sliding out of either his loosened or broken safety harness, as though a wrathful hand had pulled the straps off him, time him on the side, and tossed him in the air." Is that turn? I'm interested in this reference to the dive that resulted from slipping. There's a lot in this description that goes back to the Richard Drew photograph. To want to be free on one's personal life seems rather deadly when compared to the freedom of the fall, which will most likely result in Arnold's death. And I might add that this is not some kind of mythical fall. It has a reason, which is a broken safety harness, suggesting that the labor of migrants is so undervalued that the companies that hire them do not even take care to inspect the equipment, thus giving us the title of the story, Without Inspection. But this phrase also crucially connotes how immigrants are treated at many borders, at least the borders of the U.S., where papers are inspected and re-inspected, an often harrowing experience that Lucielli recounts in Tell Me How It Ends, which has only become worse in the U.S. since 2025. And yet Danticat would be the first also to suggest that Without Inspection is also located in a very particular time and place. From the moment the idea for the story first came to me, I imagined it as a story in which the main character is falling and is considering the most important moments and people in his life. I think that framework gives some flexibility to the narrative, she says, some elasticity, because that experience would be very different for each of us. Another news item that often catches my attention here in Miami is how many construction workers fall while working to build very expensive hotels or apartment buildings that they would not be able to afford to stay or live in. The story is a commentary on the dangerous work that immigrants do, as well as the dangerous conditions inherent in the journey to the U.S. It is significant that Arnold and Darlene survived a sea landing while others drowned. It is also significant that Darlene's son has PTSD from the experience. In this story, then, I'm very interested in the things that Arnold thinks about during his last 6 seconds alive. The harrowing journey to the U.S. shores, meeting Darlene and falling in love with her, making a family with her son Paris, as well as the fact that his falling death is described as beautiful and captured compellingly by the mediation of cell phones. Another photograph or video. There were cell phone videos of him falling, taken from different angles. Some had filmed him from the ground. Others had recorded him from their terraces and balconies. He looked, in the quickly assembled collage of these recordings, not like a person, but like a large object plummeting. He was moving too fast to be identifiable when the footage wasn't in slow motion. Again, there's this kind of uncanny resonance with that conversation from 9/11 representation, all of the controversy surrounding the falling man photograph. Does it seem disrespectful to be filming a man's fall during his moment of death? This was the charge against the famous falling man photographer. I am not sure that it is any better that this is a piece of fiction that could very well be real, except for the surreal image of the man's mental processes as he falls to his death. Here, too, the time is all wrong, too fast or too slow. He is rendered not like a person, but like, quote, a large object plummeting. Despite every possible angle of him captured, we begin to wonder whether this could ever offer proper representation of the falling death of an immigrant. And if not, what then does it say about the problem of reference, of how to refer to falling? But just as soon as I turn my interest in the representation of representation, I remind myself that I must not forget that in writing about the death of an immigrant worker, Danticat chooses surrealism, the surrealism to represent death in the story, to alert us maybe to the realities of workers in general. On the one hand, the media shows up, the construction company issues a statement. Danticat tells us, quote, that news trucks with extended antennas were lined up across the street, and reporters were interviewing both his co-workers for passers-by, and some of whom claimed that they had seen him fall. His body had failed wildly at first, they said, then plunged directly into the cement chute. His life is summed up here by news outlets, witnesses, and passers-by. I can't help but notice the focus on, quote, some of whom claimed that they had seen him fall. Is it possible, really, to see a body falling? The real truth of this man's life comes only from him, from his focalized narration, his loves and loss, his memories of making the journey by boat, and to making a living and a family in a new country. Even though it is safe to assume he has physically died after landing in the cement truck, the story gives him a future or afterlife, given the verb construction beginning with would. I should have given you this as a passage. If you have time, you might want to look at the last paragraph of the story. The representation of would be, I think, is a really interesting way to give him a future life. Would is like future tense, right? Like Darlene, he would also have two loves that outlive lovers, Darlene and Paris. That construction could easily point to an ending of his life, but then it looks to the future. He would keep trying to look for them. He would continue to hum. He would also try to guide Darlene back to the beach. These are fictional futures that can only work in the short story. To the news outlets and construction company, he is just another body. He is already dead. The question remains for critics as well as for us. Does this figure of falling work to tell the story of the trauma of immigration and migration? How much truth-telling do we want when it comes to such serious subject matter, the personal and historical forces that remain with us today? So my discussion questions in light of this argument about representations of falling through history, falling in traumatic memory, falling in particular with regard to this immigrant worker in a Haitian American story. What are drawbacks or benefits of the figure of the man falling? So there I'm thinking about the figure as a tool that authors and artists have to communicate traumatic experience. If for Caruth and Damon and even Newton, like this is at the heart of human experience, it also shows the problem of describing human experience. When is it too soon or inappropriate to tell the story of trauma? Do we want to write the story of a man who falls to his death? Do we want to tell the story of any kind of traumatic experience that seems like inappropriate to talk about or too sensitive? What does Without Inspection say about the status of the immigrant worker? This goes back to the short story in particular. And in what ways is Without Inspection a love story? So we have time for a passage, we have time for a photograph or a painting, and then we can go back to a question. Do you want to tell us where to go? Do you want to look at a photograph, a painting, a passage? Photograph? The photograph. Okay. What do you think about this? Why did this photograph of a man falling have the world on edge? Why were newspaper rooms getting phone calls saying, pull that photograph right now? What do you think when you look at it? Yes, thank you. Oh, we need microphones. Sorry, to your right. Yeah. Oh, sorry, we'll come back down here.
This photograph is personification of extreme tragedy, individual tragedy, and then showing this photograph immediately after this incident on TV channel was, this debate around whether it was cashing in on that horrific incident. Question of sensitivity was involved. Whether it was necessary to show this photograph immediately as the incident was taking place. It was happening and then the photograph started circulating.
Yes.
So this immediacy of crisis, whether we got the time to ponder over it,
yes.
that was probably in the center of this.
Great point. The immediacy is a very specific detail, right? And I think that's really important. Maybe, looking at this 20, 25 years later, it doesn't have the same impact, but we have to imagine the immediate impact. And you're so right. I'm a visual literary scholar. I look at this and I think about how uncanny it is that it seems to have been represented throughout history before, and also without inspection. But kind of to take it out of the historical context and say, oh, this is this is exemplary, this is an image, is to take it out of its history that we also have to acknowledge. That's useful.
So, just continuing the point Sir made, that when we connect this to our larger point of trauma, which we say that cannot be explained, is difficult to understand, and also to process. As he said, that the immediacy of this incident.
Yeah.
So till then, I don't think anyone would have processed what happened, understood what happened, and what is going on. So much chaos is going on. So many people died,
Yeah.
and the the immense weight of that event that took place. So probably the timing was not correct.
Yes.
At that time, it should not have been published. Maybe later, a month or two. But still, this picture that conveys the trauma is very difficult to explain.
Yes. Yeah, and you kind of get at the heart of the conversation about the relationship between text and image with regard to trauma, right? So if we say that the problem of reference is that words fail us in the sense that maybe there's not the right word or there are too many words, we have immediate access to the event via a single picture. And that's very powerful and very important, but also maybe has this kind of risk factor too.
So
and
probably that's the answer to your question that you asked, why so many newspaper editors were getting calls to get it pulled off.
Yes, I see. The immediacy. Yes.
Good afternoon, Ma'am.
Hello.
Hello. So adding to Sir's point, he mentioned the weight of this image. Something that struck me, not just in this image, but throughout this presentation, was the word falling, and this might start going into biblical territories. But as humans, we are fallen, like from Eden, and maybe this trauma, as Sir said, and he said individual trauma, I feel it might be a sense of collective trauma. And that we as humans are prone to the psychological feeling that since we fell from heaven, that maybe we cannot associate falling so easily. It brings discomfort to us. Seeing that somebody is falling probably triggers something in our psychology, that we fell, we are losing something. Life is precious, obviously, and we fell from heaven. We lost not just heaven, we lost the essence of life. And looking at this brings out those repressed feelings. And that is what it spoke to me.
Thank you. The language is living, right? So we can kind of think about the word fall at the very literal level. Here is a literal depiction of a man falling. But think about the connotations of the word to fall, falling, throughout literary and religious tradition, right? We can kind of think about the Greeks' representation of falling. There are a lot of kind of biblical stories about falling. A fall of man is a great example, right? The falling into sin. And so maybe that at the heart of all of us. So now we are, when confronted with this idea of falling, we are thinking not only about literal physical falling, but a spiritual falling or failing, a fall from grace. And both of those things are bound up in this image, I would say. That's really smart. Yes.
It is something to relate with what you just said. This image, when the first time when I looked at it, before understanding the context when you showed it to me, I don't know if it's appropriate, but I just want to put out the opinion. It looks very much like the image of Jesus Christ, and it's inverted. And one of the things I feel is that he was one of the immigrants who died for our sins, and he is dying because of our sins that we failed to speak up. Okay. And what this image could have evoked, the immediate reaction would have been guilt, because we are living in the present and we could have spoken up. Like, we refuse to speak up against this immigration crisis and everything. If you think about Americans, they see that a man in a vulnerable position crucified in every other place. Like, that image of trauma is everywhere around them. It is aesthetically presented. It is presented in every way that is possible.
Yes.
But this is and accidentally it has become aesthetic.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. It does not, that's what Shoshana Fellman says, right? Language or images, they do not know what they know, right? So maybe it is used for one purpose, but then it's like out in the world and it conveys all these other meanings, right? It means beyond itself. And I think that you were referring early to the martyr imagery, which is also seems like it could like provoke a lot of feelings in people, right? So that's really helpful. I hope I heard you right. Someone has a microphone in the back, and then we'll go to the
Yes.
the next row. Yes, sir.
About this image, show the tragedy of 9/11 through falling man, likely the trauma of immigrant. It reflects human loss, desperation, and how migrants often suffer most in global crisis.
Yes.
And I have a question for you, Professor. Why did you choose immigrants 9/11 specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, like, I was not really connecting that until halfway through this live presentation, right? Like, so I'm thinking, like, when I planned this, when you got the description, maybe like 2 weeks ago, I was thinking we would discuss the very literal, literary representation in Danticat's Without Inspection. And then I was thinking, maybe you want to know why I'm so obsessed with falling. I was drawn to Danticat's story because it's about an immigrant experience, and I wanted to spend today thinking about how the story of the migrant or the immigrant can be spoken about within a discussion of trauma studies generally. But then last night I was thinking, maybe I should show how the idea or the image of falling has been received in the last 20 years. So we have 9/11's, representation of falling on the one hand, and we have Danticat's representation of falling in the context of immigration. I mean, I think that's so interesting. Danticat, a Haitian American writer, chooses to tell the story of a Haitian American immigrant through the story of his falling. Maybe that's the question we could ask Danticat, right? But that is there. It exists in the world. So I'm not sure if I'm trying to say that this is an immigrant story. It's certainly like there's a way in which we could talk about the way that this image was described as it's transported into Danticat's story. Maybe that wasn't on purpose, but I see it. That's my connection. And I should go back to, this also is a worker, right? This was a worker on the very top floor. He was a server in the Windows on the World restaurant. I love your question. I should kind of think about whether he has an immigrant story, right? And how would that tie together our conversation about immigration and how it's represented through the figure of falling. So I answered your question with a question. It's really good. Yes.
Ma'am, to me, the posture of this man seems so calm and relaxed. It is as if while he's falling in those few seconds, he has sort of made peace with his mortality. And maybe while this picture was getting taken, he was thinking about his family and his happy memories.
Yes. Don't you see, reading retrospectively, is this our Danticat character who is, thinking about his life in, 5.5 seconds or something, right? And we can impose on this image what we want to see, which is maybe it does look peaceful and serene, right? We have no idea what is going on in his head. That's what Danticat's fiction allows us to imagine. Yeah, and maybe that's a part of why people thought this was provocative. We all looked at this and thought, oh, it's so perfect. Like, artistically speaking, there is a kind of calm parallelism to it. And maybe that's not what you want the takeaway message to be if you are trying to depict the moment itself. Yeah, really tricky. Behind you.
Where on one hand we see this image as really aesthetic or pleasing to eyes, more artistic, in my opinion, why they would have asked to take down this image could have been because, like Caruth states, that trauma never comes at the right time. Hence, this picture sort of points out at the uncertainty of any one of us being in that state, being in that position where somebody chooses the volunteered involuntary death, or a suicide that isn't a choice but is occurring because there's no other choice. So to me, this is what the picture translates.
Yes. I love that you're reading the history of this photograph as the history of trauma itself. This photograph did not come at the right time. It is out of time. It is both too soon and too late. And the other thing you're talking about is like the emotional resonances. Like some people looked at this and thought, this is such a private moment. This man has had to make a decision to take his own life. And I know that the idea of suicide is very provocative in a lot of communities, right? Especially for his family. When they were like trying to locate his family, they said, we have nothing to do with this. No person in this family, no person I love would choose to take his life. But then the other side of that is like it was a choiceless choice that one made, right? And so the photograph honors that, but also maybe it inserts itself into this private moment of a person that maybe should be respected. Maybe we don't want to take a picture of that, right? Like maybe we don't want to take a picture of certain private spiritual moments. So you're absolutely right in kind of pointing up the double bind of the very fact of this image itself.
Ma'am.
Yes?
To add something with their point, I want to say that this picture symbolizes the human condition that is stuck between life and death. I mean, life is a cycle of life and death, and this picture, the man is stuck between this life and death.
Yes. Remember, Juno said that his friend called him and said, "Congratulations! Now we know we're all falling men now, right?" And that has to do with the artistic response, but it also, like, uncannily communicates what we're all feeling. We are all falling men now. We always have been falling men, right? And women. We've always been between life and death. From the moment of our birth, we've been falling. And so there's that kind of, maybe that, it's the punctum, right, that we talked about through Marianne Hirsch's reading. Maybe it has as much to do with a representation of history or a personal decision as it has to do with our own confrontation through this picture with the fact that we are falling too. We are on our way to death. That's very existential.
There's one more thing I would like to add to it is there's one more picture by Kevin Carter, the vulture picture where there's a girl sitting and then there's a vulture behind it. So what provokes is that the photographer is more interested into showcasing his skills rather than throwing an attempt at saving the life of somebody who is into such a vulnerable state.
Yes.
Both of these pictures sort of translate to that.
Beautiful. You hear that in war photography a lot, right? Contemporary war photographers are often asked that. Why are you hiding behind your camera and looking for the perfect shot when you're in the middle of a war zone where people need help? We talked about that with Kaushik too, right? The fictional character from Going Ashore. He is there to kind of capture history and is looking for the good shot, right? Rather than getting involved. And so we could kind of think about what it it meant for Richard Drew on his way to a fashion show, no less, to get off the train and look up and say, wow, that's a beautiful image. That's a perfect image. I have to capture that right now. Meanwhile, there's just chaos around him, right? So I feel like that's like the position of the photographer generally, and these kinds of artistic renditions like point that up in dramatic ways. Yes.
Ma'am, as much as it's important to save these pictures from public viewing because it triggers trauma, but I think it's also very important to publish them, not immediately, but to wait for some reception, is because it is to identify who we are while witnessing these pictures. Like, how do we confront our trauma? Like, am I a kind of person who instantly gets triggered by that? Or am I the kind of person who kind of wants that to seep in and want to think about on it later? So, as much as it says about the person in the photograph falling, it also says so much about the person who is watching or seeing that photograph.
Yes. Well said. Maybe if we're thinking about how that represents the man falling, we're asking the wrong question, right? We should be looking inward and at ourselves, at how our response tells us something about us. And you've also kind of talked about the importance of the archive from our last conversation, right? Like, this is a part of the archive now. For a long time it wasn't, right? It was like the status was called into question. But this is something that lives online, that is one part of a very, very large story, of a historical event, but also, as you all have been saying, the story of humanity in many ways.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hello?
Actually, when I look at this image, I come across a great poem by William Wordsworth. The world is too much with us,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So this picture depicts a very clear contrast, a very clear darkness of the world. You know, the people are not left free even at the time of death. Their peace is troubled. And you see, this is the tragedy of human curiosity. This is the tragedy, actually. We feel that we are curious and we want to know, we want to get into a lot of things, we want to explore a lot of things. Actually, we want to explore everything. But we don't see the tragedy of it. The tragedy of exploring, the tragedy of human curiosity.
Yeah.
That the world is too much with us. We entered into the lives of the people when they don't want us.
Yes.
Right. So this picture is basically the dark side of the world, the dark side of the people, capturing the moment when they don't want the moment to be captured.
Okay, yeah.
So this is what I feel.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, nobody asked this man, right, if we could take his picture.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we might focus on him, but look at what's in the background. The world is too much with us. I love that saying. I say that a lot, actually. The most stunning part, even though the man is centered, as if he were painted there, right, centered right directly in the middle, is a huge building, a skyscraper, right? And the way the light falls, half of it is darkened by shadows, the right half is lit up. It's a structure that talks about showcases science, civilization, right? Like, maybe that's the world behind him, and it has an impact, right?
And one more thing, ma'am, also, like you said, the picture, the man is centered in the entire, canvas, right?
Yes.
So you see the urgency of knowing the feelings of a man, the urgency of knowing the state of the man, rather sensing the tragedy. We are into a lot of knowing things rather than sensing them, and actually the feeling makes a difference, the knowledge does not. I feel so. When you sense something and when you know something, it has got a vast difference. So we are much into knowing something, whether it's trauma, whether it's tragedy, whether it's the falling man, whatever it is, but but we fail to sense.
Yes.
And that's actually the center of the picture depicts. We fail to sense.
Yes, that's great.
So this is, thank you.
Thank you. I think that should be the last word, right? A focus on our failure of mastering this yet again, this question and this image. So thank you, everybody, for being engaged for our the last lecture of the morning. I think it's lunchtime now, right? And then we'll come back at 2:00. So great job. Thank you, everybody.